Well, here we are. The end of the line, at least as far as the Master Chief Collection is concerned. Halo 4. And boy is there a lot to dive into. When Microsoft bought Bungie in 2000, they invested a lot of additional resources into the up-and-coming game that the tiny studio was developing. A franchise development team was assembled within Microsoft, responsible for working with Bungie and various partners to produce additional Halo materials to grow the franchise. Notably, they were responsible for the various Halo novels over the years, among other things. Following Bungie's split from Microsoft in June of 2007, the franchise team would become the foundation of a new studio responsible for shepherding the Halo franchise as it moved forward. This new studio would be 343 Industries. Established under the leadership of Bonnie Ross, a handful of former Bungie employees and franchise contributors would become the initial members of 343 Industries, eventually hiring on new talent from across the gaming industry and from within the Halo fanbase. The early days of 343 saw them aiding with spin-off media such as Halo Wars, expanded universe material like Halo Helljumper or Halo Evolutions, and the creation of the media hub, Halo Waypoint. At the same time, they began work on what would become their first real game, Halo 4. The roller coaster that must have been Halo 4's development is something I can only begin to imagine. Try to picture building a game studio basically from the ground up while developing a roadmap for one of the biggest transmedia franchises of all time. It's a daunting task that really had no precedent at the time, and I would not be envious of anyone who took on such a project. But 343 did, and those are the conditions under which Halo 4 was created. The employees of 343 were not newbies, and the company had many notable industry veterans. However, this was the first time the team would come together for a project, and not just any project, but the sequel and, in spirit, reboot of one of the biggest gaming franchises. For better or worse, 343 wanted to establish themselves as more than just the new Halo studio, to avoid the shadow Bungie cast with the original trilogy. This wasn't to say that they wanted to throw out the legacy of these games, but rather to establish their own direction while paying respect to what came before. And in just about every way, Halo 4 does just that. Halo 4's campaign opens with a human ship boarded by a collection of various aliens while drifting towards an unknown alien construct. Soon our main green man and his blue AI counterpart crash on a serene artificial world and must find their way home. However, along the way a new evil rears its head and the big man has to save humanity from this ancient foe. Sounds pretty familiar, right? In many ways, Halo 4 is an homage to Halo CE and the franchise at large, with callbacks to classic and memorable moments throughout. And while Halo 4 sported a new look across the board for just about everything, it attempted to do so without alienating the established fans. Seriously, laugh if you want, it did try to do this. Whether you liked the fruits of that labor may be a different story. But more than just a new look, Halo 4 tried to move away from a focus on galaxy-ending weapons, at least in regards to the core of the story, focusing instead on a more character-driven narrative, one that explored what a Spartan was, what it meant to be a savior, and the weight that comes with it. As such, Halo 4's take on the Master Chief is a bit more talkative during gameplay than he'd previously been, in that he had previously never talked during gameplay, and more in line with his portrayal in the books. A lot of lore once regulated solely to the books is brought into Halo 4, and while I maintain that any answers one could seek are in the game itself, I won't lie and say that its presentation didn't leave something to be desired. Halo 4 marked the start of what was called at the time the Reclaimer Trilogy and later the Reclaimer Saga, focusing on a new conflict after the Human Covenant War that dove more into the enigmatic Forerunners that lay at the heart of the series. It would introduce a real villain and nemesis for the Master Chief in the form of the Didact, a corrupt Forerunner who had been sealed inside of a shield world prior to the firing of the Halo array. Ultimately, Halo 4 would once again see the Chief save humanity, this time from the Didact, but fail to save his companion, Cortana. It's a very familiar bittersweet victory for the Chief, but also a deconstruction of the mythical status he had achieved at that point, at least from a meta-analysis perspective. Along with the Didact, Halo 4 introduced a new class of enemy, the Prometheans. The Prometheans come in three basic forms: Knights, Watchers, and Crawlers. Knights and Crawlers also had subclasses with different designs and weaponry to change up the fights. The Prometheans were designed to work together more than previous Halo mobs, such as Watchers summoning Crawlers or providing defense for Knights, in an attempt to change up how things played out. There were mixed results to say the least, and some of the new Promethean abilities were found to be more annoying than others. Like much of Halo 4, the Prometheans received a mixed reception. As had become tradition by this point, Halo 4 featured terminals, video ones like Halo CE Anniversary, along with lesser-known audio logs that could be found throughout the levels and enrich the experience. Sadly, where Halo CE had allowed terminals to play in-game, Halo 4's terminals would just be unlocked in the companion Halo Waypoint app on the Xbox 360. When Halo 4 came to the Xbox One with the Master Chief Collection, it and all other video terminals required the Halo Channel app to play, an app that was horribly unoptimized at launch and has several issues to this day. Thankfully, the PC version and Xbox update will play terminals in-game. However, there is a Terminal Zero, a prequel terminal that was originally released online that currently only plays on YouTube. Hopefully this can be added to MCC one day, but we'll have to wait and see. Finally, I have to talk about the music. Oh, the music. Where does one go to follow up on the legendary soundtracks of Marty O'Donnell? How does one craft a new musical experience for a new story? For 343, that answer was Neil Davidge and Kazuma Jinouchi. Together, these men forged a new Halo soundtrack. While it didn't completely throw out the tunes of Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore, it was largely new musical compositions representative of the new direction for Halo. For some fans, it was labeled generic, but I couldn't disagree more. There's a clear passion and intent that went into Halo 4's soundtrack. Not unlike Halo 3 ODST, where Marty O'Donnell noted that he, quote, threw away all the Halo themes we had ever heard and decided to try something new, Kazuma and Neil crafted a new musical experience that represented the focus of this new saga, the Forerunners and the Reclamation. While these weren't absent from previous games, of course, the Forerunner saga, as it manifested in Halo 4, focuses on the Forerunners as active participants, their architecture no longer ancient and mysterious, but alive and dynamic. On the human side of things, Spartan John 117 and his AI Cortana are thrown into a new conflict with a living Forerunner tasked with beginning the Reclamation, all while being at the center of a very human drama story. This required a new approach to Halo's soundtrack, and that's exactly what was delivered. Halo 4 was meant to be the start of a new, more personal story, and while it certainly has its defenders, there was unfortunately enough of an outcry against it that we may never see a proper resolution to the story threads it started. Halo Infinite could prove me wrong, but I'm not holding my breath at this moment. Multiplayer for Halo 4 had a similar reception to its campaign, bringing in several changes and additions, some less welcome than others. Controversially, though Halo 4 is a sequel to Halo 3, its gameplay builds on the direction started with Halo Reach, featuring loadouts, armor abilities, and more new features. Whenever talking about these changes, I think it's important to remember that Halo 4 began development around 2009 at the latest. By the time it came out, it was said to have had a 3.5-year development cycle, which could mean pre-production started back in 2008, if not earlier. Regardless, the point I mean to make is that 343 began with Halo Reach as its foundation, because that was the most recent game at the time, even though it hadn't been released, and by the time that actionable feedback would come in, around 2011, the game was just over a year from release. I wish Halo 4 had been an Xbox One launch title, potentially giving 343 the time to retool the game, but it wasn't, so they couldn't. Not at its core, at the very least. Back to the actual point though, Halo 4 multiplayer made the controversial sprint ability a default for all players, which I think is probably a way to do it if it has to be done at all, and expanded the offering of armor abilities found in Halo Reach. In addition, it introduced support upgrades and technical packages, armor mods that granted extra abilities such as spawning with 2 primary weapons, unlimited sprint, faster reloading, or picking up grenades from fallen enemies, to name a few of the various functions. All of these were wrapped together with Halo 4's player-controlled loadout system, wherein players could choose their primary and secondary weapons, armor abilities, and armor mods they would spawn with. Each player could create 5 loadouts that they'd be able to select from when respawning during certain game types. And while certain game types had preset loadouts or no loadouts at all, at launch Halo 4 was dominated by player loadout-enabled game types. These would also highlight a number of Halo 4's other new features. In traditional Halo, when shot at, a player would de-scope if they were at all scoped in. Halo 4 replaced this with a flinch, in which a player's view would simply be shifted a bit depending on how much damage they were receiving. Halo 4 also introduced a heavier reward system, with most actions having a point value and medals, and earning enough points would allow a player to call in ordnance. These are often compared to kill streaks, but I honestly never cared for that comparison. I get it, but their functionality is a little too different for me, so to me the comparison is moot at best. Regardless though, this made Halo 4 a very different experience across the board. Still, the core Halo gameplay was largely still there, with guns, grenades, and melee galore. Halo 4 both expanded and contracted game type offerings for Halo, introducing new games like Regicide, Dominion, or Extraction. It also retooled game types like CTF and Infection. In the former case, it allowed the flag carrier to wield a pistol when carrying the flag, this affectionately referred to as the flagnum, and in the latter, the infected would take on a Flood-inspired appearance, the mode even being renamed Flood. Sadly, this change resulted in heavy restrictions on the game type, as infected could only spawn with the Flood Claw, as it were, basically a sword. At the same time, game types like Headhunter, Juggernaut, and Territories, to name just a few, disappeared from the series. At launch too, several systems players had come to expect were gone, such as the Red X over a fallen player, or skill-based ranks. These were eventually patched into the game down the line, but are definitely features that should have been there from the start. Perhaps one of the most controversial changes to Halo 4's multiplayer, however, was the removal of playable elites, a feature that had been a staple of the series since Halo 2. While Halo Reach certainly scaled back on the elites both in terms of customization and how often they were in multiplayer, they were nevertheless still present. Not the case for Halo 4. Halo 4 would take a new approach to Halo on just about every level. As part of that, traditional multiplayer was repackaged under the title War Games. Further, War Games was no longer a simple mode, but integrated into the lore of Halo. I've made a video that goes into this concept in detail, but the simple version is that multiplayer is a holodeck-style simulation on board the UNSC Infinity meant to train Spartan 4s. Or if you're familiar with Bionicle at all, that, but with holographic overlays. The lore approach didn't stop there, making its way into just about every other aspect of the game. In terms of customization, the entire system revolved around a Spartan career, simulating a player's rise in Spartan rank and earning more armors. At the end of the more simplistic leveling system were a series of quote-unquote specializations, again steeped in their own lore, giving players a more focused unlock experience. And a quick side note, there's been a persistent rumor since Halo 4's release that the reason elites were removed from multiplayer is because of this added lore focus, but this is not remotely the case. In canon, Spartans and elites do train together, and there are even elites stationed directly on Infinity at times. Never mind that the Infinity's holographic systems could easily simulate an elite over a Spartan in the same way it does to make Spartans appear infected in the Flood game type. So no, lore was in no way the reason, or any reason, for the removal of elites from multiplayer in Halo 4. And anyway, finally, there were also commendations that players could earn, a carryover from Halo Reach. Halo 4 was a Halo game at its core, but one can see why it didn't land well with fans of the pre-Reach games. Both the aforementioned multiplayer and Forge were created in conjunction with Certain Affinity, a third-party developer founded by former Bungie employee Max Hoberman and based in Austin, Texas. Like multiplayer, Forge received quite the overhaul for Halo 4, in some ways for the better, in other ways, not so much. Starting with the positives though, objects included more themed textures rather than the repetitive Forerunner gray of much of Halo Reach. In lieu of something like Forge World, Halo 4 introduced several Forge canvases, blank maps with a variety of themes, locations, and terrains, and later included a map called Forge Island, a large open map with 3 flat circular islands people could forge on. A magnet system was also added to make placing objects together much easier, and perhaps most notable of all, a baked lighting system was added. This meant that when players exited the editing mode, the map would project and then bake lighting onto the map to make the Forge objects seem more like a part of their map rather than apart from it. On the downside, object hitboxes weren't always on model, meaning players could, for example, look like they're floating above floors or be unable to shoot through holes in some instances. The magnetic locking points on objects were also hand-placed, meaning that stuff could be misaligned. And perhaps worst of all, a glitch removed the fine editing and zoom functionality that Halo Reach had introduced. Luckily, this glitch was fixed for Halo 4 in MCC, but back in 2012, it was a huge hit to the Forge community, at least as I recall. Still, 343 did try to expand on what players could do and the accessibility of Forge for players overall. And like multiplayer, Forge found its place in the canon as an in-universe tool that could be used to create maps for wargame simulations as part of the UNSC Cartographer Initiative. After the introduction of Firefight in Halo 3 ODST and its continuation in Halo Reach, often referred to as Firefight 2.0, it was naturally expected that the mode would return for Halo 4. However, continuing with their more lore-driven approach to Halo, 343 looked to bring a new style of PvE experience to Halo, a way to engage fans for weeks and months after the game launched and provide more story content for those who sought it. This would ultimately result in Spartan Ops. If Forge was map creation, Wargames is training, and Theater was after-action review, Spartan Ops is what it would all be leading towards in terms of lore: in-field operations. Set 6 months after Halo 4, Spartan Ops was an episodic story that each week would provide new pre-rendered episodes of Halo Infinity, featuring Fireteam Majestic and its exploits on Requiem. At the same time, 5 new missions would unlock for players to enjoy. These missions would allow players to take their multiplayer Spartan into the action, much like what Halo Reach did, fulfilling various missions and advancing a story as part of Fireteam Crimson. In theory, it was a great new way to engage the community. Unfortunately, not all great ideas are great in practice. From the moment it was announced, Spartan Ops had a hard sell given that it was replacing a brief-lived but beloved mode. At launch, it was found that many of the missions reused campaign levels with minor changes, and the mission designs themselves were rather simple and uninspired. On a more personal note, I always found that Halo 4's approach to difficulty scaling to be rather boring, let's say, often just flooding players with enemies and making them tougher on higher difficulties. It made for a rather unengaging experience overall. Spartan Ops certainly has its fans, but it wasn't the hit that 343 surely hoped for. I will note though that the second half of Spartan Ops was much better received, with more cinematic moments, mission and environment variety, and more, but by then, it was too late. While this second half was much better received by those who played it, the experiment had proven too expensive to produce for too little return, and as such, Spartan Ops ended after its first season. Its storyline wrapped up instead in the comic series Halo Escalation. Spartan Ops, to my knowledge, didn't exactly find a second life in MCC, but who knows how the Halo PC crowd might react. Despite its flaws, many look back on Spartan Ops now as an innovative idea that didn't get the best treatment, both in terms of its design and the fate of the story threads it introduced. Wrapping things up is, of course, Theater. Halo 4's Theater functioned basically how it did in Halo Reach with a slightly updated UI. However, one major change was the mode being restricted to multiplayer. Neither campaign nor Spartan Ops would appear in Theater, a major disappointment to many fans. Not only was this taking away a major feature that had been in 3 previous titles, no explanation was ever given, at least as I recall. There were talks at one point about campaign and Spartan Ops support being added down the line, but that never happened. Mods did prove that it could be done, and one can only hope that such mods will make their way to PC when Halo 4 releases there. And that wraps up Halo 4. It was a fun game in its own right, one I still think gets far too harshly criticized, though that isn't to say that there's not valid criticism to lay against it. Still, I think if 343 had stuck to their guns, the groundwork started by Halo 4 could have led to a very interesting story for Halo. And speaking of, let's talk about some extra media that you can look into to enhance your Halo 4 experience. Before it comes out on PC in a couple of days. Starting things off is, of course, the 2 book series that 343 commissioned specifically to tie into Halo 4. First up is the Kilo 5 trilogy, comprised of Glasslands, The Thursday War, and Mortal Dictata. These books overall have a loose connection to Halo 4's core story, but Glasslands and Thursday War both introduce Julim Dama, the leader of the Covenant faction fought in Halo 4 and Spartan Ops, along with the Infinity and a couple characters like Thomas Lasky and Andrew Del Rio. Much of the story centers around the titular Kilo 5 Special Operations Team, run by Captain Saren Osman of Oni, and their work in a post-Human Covenant War galaxy. Second is the Forerunner saga with much heavier ties to Halo 4. These 3 books, Cryptum, Primordium, and Silentium, delve into Forerunner society and history, the Forerunner Flood War, the creation of the Halo Rings, and most notably, the Didact, Halo 4's main villain. It's a fascinating dive into an era only hinted at previously by sci-fi legend Greg Bear, who absolutely brings his A-game to these books. To note though, this is not required reading to understand Halo 4, no more than Halo The Fall of Reach is required to understand Halo CE. Halo 4 does not in any way require knowledge from beyond the games to understand. Period. Moving on, next on the chopping block are the comics Halo Initiation and Halo Escalation. Though these came out well after Halo 4 and have a poor reception among the community, at least in my opinion, they do have their place in the fiction, and just because I don't enjoy them doesn't mean you can't. Initiation is set just after the Human Covenant War and gives some backstory on Spartan Sarah Palmer, prominently featured in Halo 4 and Spartan Ops. Halo Escalation continues Spartan Ops' storyline after the final episode and leads up to Halo 5. While it might be better experienced after playing Halo 4, it certainly bears mentioning here. Both can easily be acquired these days via the Halo Library Editions Volumes 1 and 2, which have both complete series, along with author commentary if you're into that. Next is the game Halo Spartan Assault. Originally a mobile and Windows 10 game, it was eventually ported to Xbox 360 and Xbox One with added missions and a co-op mode. Story-wise, it adds further characterization to Sarah Palmer in a manner that even people that disliked her managed to find value in. It's also a fun twin-stick shooter to kill time with. After that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the marketing. For Halo 4, we have 2 trailers to mention. First is the commissioning, depicting the formal commissioning of the UNSC Infinity, intercut with it being pulled into Requiem. It actually paints the latter events in a very horrific manner, which, going off what Chief experiences at the start of Halo 4, probably isn't far off. The second is called Scanned, featuring the Chief being captured by the Didact, then his memories scanned, revealing some of his backstory in ways never previously visualized. For lore fans like myself, it's hard to overstate how enjoyable this particular trailer was back when it dropped. And finally, I have to mention the ultimate piece of marketing, Halo's first live-action movie/series, Halo 4: Forward Unto Dawn. This tells the backstory of future commander, then captain of the UNSC Infinity, Thomas Lasky, and his fateful meeting with the Master Chief near the start of the Human Covenant War. It's a pretty good series given its budget and the fact that it was originally released as a 5-part web series. These days though, it can be found more easily in its 90-minute movie cut. There are also a number of trailers and extras that further flesh things out, but even on its own, the movie is worth a watch. Everything I've mentioned is available for purchase in one form or another online, with the trailers of course being available on YouTube. There's probably more I could mention that ties into Halo 4 in some form or another, but this is a good place to start, I'd say. So, that's Halo 4. What did you think of the game back when it launched? How have your views evolved since then? What are you looking forward to most in regards to its PC release and Xbox update? Let me know in the comments below. For now, this has been Halo Canon, and I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing, and if you really love me, hit that notification bell and leave a thumbs up. These both really help out the channel. I wouldn't be where I am now without your views and support, so once again, thank you. Keep on being awesome, Canonites.